A Spartacus moment. I'm Michael Smerconish in Philadelphia. Americans first heard of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky after the infamous July 25, 2019 telephone call that led to former President Donald Trump's first impeachment. Zelensky had just been elected Ukrainian president in a landslide election. He was eager to receive the $400 million of U.S. security aid that had been earmarked by Congress for his nation to fend off a Russian threat and to obtain a commitment to meet the American president so as to project unity and strength toward his Russian aggressors. But after Trump injected a request that Zelensky first investigate the Bidens, Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, who was listening to the call as part of his National Security Council duties, reported what he heard, and the rest is history. Well, for the last 3 days, we have seen why Zelensky was so eager for U.S. assistance. Now the former actor and comedian has been transformed from an American political footnote to the new face of freedom and defiance. Trump is gone from office, but the question of whether the U.S. is giving Zelensky all he needs lingers on President Joe Biden's watch. It's fair to say the U.S. and NATO acquiesced to Russia's invasion. On December 8 of last year, after meeting with Putin, Biden told reporters that sending troops to Ukraine to deter Russia was not on the table. And on February 10th of this year, when asked by NBC's Lester Holt what scenario could prompt him to send troops to rescue Americans fleeing the country, Biden replied, "There's not. That's a world war when Americans and Russia start shooting at one another." As for NATO, on January 30th, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg told the BBC, "We have no plans to deploy NATO combat troops to Ukraine. We are focusing on providing support." And then just a few days later, on February 4, the NATO Deputy Secretary General told a French outlet that NATO, quote, "will not get involved militarily in Ukraine. We support Ukraine in many other ways. Individual allies support Ukraine." So Putin knew that the only thing standing between Russia and Kyiv was the overmatched Ukrainian army. No wonder that Friday, President Zelensky lamented, "We are defending our country alone." Just like yesterday, the most powerful country in the world looked on from a distance. And just this morning, he said this: "The destruction by missiles and artillery of residential buildings is the ultimate argument for the world to be by our side in stopping the occupiers' invasion." He also appealed to volunteers from abroad, quote, "All the friends who want to join us, please come. We will give you weapons." The Ukrainians are certainly doing what they can do. Nothing better sums up their resilience than when 13 border guards on Ukraine's Snake Island refused to surrender to Russian invaders. The final words, "Hey, Russian warship, go F yourself," just before all 13 then died in a bombardment, defines the conflict to date. President Zelensky has announced that they will posthumously be awarded the nation's title of Hero of Ukraine. Nevertheless, it's hard to believe the Ukrainian resistance can hold on for much longer, nor that this will end well in the long run for Russia. Ukrainians are fighting for love of country. Russians are fighting out of a fear of a dictator. And there are signs of that support buckling. On Tuesday, Putin needed to give his own spy chief a public dressing down at a Security Council meeting after recognizing the independence of two separatist-controlled regions of Ukraine, his subterfuge for the war. Russian cultural leaders, including musicians, TV stars, and comedians, have been voicing resistance on social media. Thursday night, something once unfathomable, 1,000 people gathered in the center of Moscow chanting "No to war" as passing cars honked horns. And there were similar gatherings in other Russian cities, including St. Petersburg, despite a warning from Russian authorities that they would face jail time. On Friday, the daughter of Putin's own Kremlin spokesperson posted an anti-war slogan on social media. Elizaveta Peskova is 24 and posted "No to war" on her Instagram account. Zelensky, for his part, is courageous and a bit fatalistic. He has thus far rebuffed U.S. offers to evacuate Kyiv to avoid being captured or killed. On Friday, he said, "According to the information we have, the enemy has marked me as target number 1, my family as target number 2. Later on Friday, for the first time, NATO activated its response force as a defensive measure That doesn't mean that the U.S. or NATO forces will enter Ukraine because Ukraine is not a NATO member, but it's a sign of increased nervousness on the part of neighboring NATO members. But it's probably not enough. The only way to thwart Russian aggression probably is by offensive action by the U.S. and NATO. But 20 years post 9/11, Americans are fatigued by war in distant lands. There's nothing funny about the situation, but it's a former comedian to whom we can all look for inspiration. I want to know what you think. This hour, go to my website at Smerconish.com and answer this week's survey question. Should NATO go to war for Ukraine? Joining me now to discuss is retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, former Director for European Affairs on the National Security Council. He's also author of the best-selling memoir, Here, Right Matters, and he recently wrote this piece for The Atlantic, America Could Have Done So Much More to Protect Ukraine. Colonel Vindman, thank you for being here. What could we have done, and what should we be doing now?
Sure. The biggest arrest to the Biden team's policy is 20 years of ineffective Russia policy. So that just very bounded what they were even thinking about doing. With regards to the diplomatic announcement that you pointed out back in December, no boots on the ground, that did not need to happen. But it was a fear of somehow this spiraling to bilateral confrontation that drove President Biden to say that. Instead, we could have maintained the strategic ambiguity policy that we continue to maintain with regards to Taiwan, that our U.S. action may be on the table and that the Russians need a program and calculate it in. That could have been a huge deterrent. It kind of gave a blinking yellow light. But again, it's not just Joe Biden's fault. It's bigger than that. What we could have done is we could have provisioned the Ukrainians with even more lethal aid. They're sorely lacking in air defense capabilities. They're sorely lacking in the ability to threaten those ships off the coast of Odessa, the largest port city in Ukraine, with coastal defense systems like Harpoons. That we were just too narrow in our thinking about the consequences and the fact that we seem to recognize that something like this might come, but we were fatalistic and defeatist about providing Ukraine. Now Ukraine is leading the world. They're leading the world in pushing back against authoritarianism. President Zelensky is deeply inspiring. He's a world leader now. He's leading the charge of democracy against authoritarianism, and we need to provision him. There are still things we can do. It's amazing what's unfolding on the battlefield. The Ukrainian armed forces have basically stopped Russian forces in most of the country in their tracks. The biggest gains are in the south. That's also a huge distance between there and Kiev. But with additional armor, with additional air defense capabilities, they could start to equalize a little bit. They're not going to be sufficient against Russia's high flyers, those aircraft that are flying way above these man pads, these stingers, but it's going to be something. And we should think about more capable systems. There are more capable systems like THAAD that we could quickly kind of show them how to press the right buttons, push them across for the Ukrainians to defend themselves. Those are high altitude systems. And really in this critical moment, they should be getting unmanned aerial vehicles. They've already demonstrated a proficiency in using unmanned aerial vehicles with strike capability. Push them across to Ukraine. Let them start to hit targets. Probably not the targets that are right in their faces, but the deep targets that support them. Those cruise missile and ballistic missile platforms that are firing from across the border, start to take some of those out and degrade Russia's ability to really to conduct its operations. And then you go after logistics. Logistics is going to be central. Right now, the bulk of the casualties the Russians have received are in frontline units. That's shocking. Those are the units that should be achieving penetration. Instead, they've moved too fast. They've outrun their logistics tail. It's 3 times the size behind those offensive units. Those are going to be vulnerable. The Ukrainians can start targeting those and completely freeze the Russian armed forces. It's still a hard slog, but frankly, sorry, I just want to say, still a hard slog, but there's a glimmer of light here. We need to continue to nurture that.
I share your assessment of the inspiration that I feel from Zelensky. It puts, I think, in a totally different light, maybe not for you, but for me as an outsider, that telephone call. I went back and I reread the transcript, and I've read your assessment of it from your memoir. This guy was coming to us hat in hand. He wanted the $400 million released. He wanted the grin and grip. He wanted the photo op. He wanted to project unity and strength at the side of the United States to prevent exactly what's unfolding. Give me your final thought on that.
That's exactly right. And we lost a major opportunity to harden Ukraine in the intervening years. After that moment, we basically put the relationship with Ukraine on pause, certainly for the rest of the Trump administration, but even to the Biden administration. And we lost an opportunity to harden Ukraine, to make it less palatable for Putin to even conduct this offensive operation if that was avoidable. Last thing I want to mention is pressure. Huge building pressure on Russia. The Turks have ceased permitting Russian warships to transit the Straits, the Dardanelles Straits, into and out of the Black Sea. That has never happened before. That is going to be critical. With protests, with swift sanctions, because of the pressure that the Ukrainians are applying, diplomatic engagement to get countries to buy into that, we're seeing a coalescence of effort. We just need the U.S. to come in with a Lend-Lease program to give the Ukrainians what they need to duke this out.